When the first tanks appeared in World War I, they were relatively lightly armoured and protected the crews only against small arms fire. In addition, much of the armour was riveted. Projectiles striking the exterior of the armour could pop off rivet heads or flake armour from the internal surfaces, creating fragments that would fly around the vehicle interior, causing injuries or death. In fact, British tank crews had to wear protective goggles and chainmail masks to guard against fragments made by bullets striking close to their open vision slits. The Mauser set the stage and ushered in the age of the anti-tank rifle, or ATR. Most major combatants, with the notable exception of the United States, fielded these weapons during the interwar years and through the beginning of World War II. Countries such as Finland, Switzerland and Japan went the big bore route, utilising 20mm weapons. The Germans and Poles used 7.92mm weapons, firing steel or tungsten-cored small projectiles at incredibly high velocities. To the tanks of the 1930s, these weapons were a potent threat, but by 1942 they were hopelessly outclassed. The British Mark I, Mark I Star, and Mark II Boys anti-tank rifles were typical of the breed. Originally to be dubbed the stanchion rifle, instead, the weapon received its name from the designer, Captain H.C. Boys, the Assistant Superintendent of Design for the British Small Arms Committee. Captain Boys died only a few days before his weapon was adopted into British military service in 1937, and the anti-tank rifle was renamed in his honour. It was often misspelled as Boys. The Imperial German Army's first attempt to give the infantry a man-portable anti-tank weapon resulted in the company Waffenfabrik Mauser AG creating and manufacturing the first anti-tank rifle in 1917. This was the Mauser Tankgewehr model 1918, essentially a standard Mauser bolt-action rifle on steroids, firing a huge 13.2mm round and equipped with a bipod, a very unpleasant brute to fire. The T-Gewehr's most impressive feat was that it was being fielded to frontline infantry within 9 months of the tank's first appearance on the battlefield. The Mauser set the stage and ushered in the age of the anti-tank rifle, or a TR. Most major combatants, with the notable exception of the United States, fielded these weapons during the interwar years and through the beginning of World War II. Countries such as Finland, Switzerland and Japan went the big bore route, utilising 20mm weapons. The Germans and Poles used 7.92mm weapons, firing steel or tungsten-cored small projectiles at incredibly high velocities. To the tanks of the 1930s, these weapons were a potent threat. By 1942, however, they were hopelessly outclassed. The British Mark I, Mark I Star, and Mark II Boys anti-tank rifles were typical of the breed. Originally to be dubbed the stanchion rifle, instead, the weapon received its name from the designer, Captain H.C. Boys, the Assistant Superintendent of Design for the British Small Arms Committee. Captain Boys died only a few days before his weapon was adopted into British military service in 1937, and the anti-tank rifle was renamed in his honour. It was often misspelled as Boys. The Boys had a 3-foot-long barrel, was 63.5 inches long overall and weighed 36 pounds. This particular weapon was a repeater, a bolt-action, that was fed by a 5-shot detachable box magazine mounted atop the weapon in a fashion similar to the famous Bren light machine gun. Empty cartridge cases were ejected from the bottom of the action, rather than the top. Just the loaded magazine weighed some 2.6 pounds, and weight does not endear any weapon to the infantryman. The Mark I Boys initially fired a .55 caliber, 13.9 by 99mm, steel-cored AP, armour-piercing projectile with a muzzle velocity of around 2,500 feet per second, which was changed to a lighter bullet with a velocity of 2,900 feet per second in the Mark II load. Later, an even more effective tungsten called APCR, armour-piercing composite rigid, was developed. It boasted a muzzle velocity of well in excess of 3,000 feet per second. This load proved capable of penetrating 20 millimeters of armour plate at 300 yards. The early production Boys Mark I had the circular muzzle brake, which vented gases in all directions. Fired from an otherwise good low-profile position, the rifle regularly kicked up a blast of dust and debris that could give the operator's position away. Later designs featured a flat harmonica-style muzzle brake, which vented all gases to the sides to correct this problem, and had the added benefit of being easier to manufacture. The harmonica-shaped Mark I-star muzzle brake, or recoil reducer, helped tame the weapon's massive kick. In addition, the barrel itself recoiled an inch against a heavy shock absorber mounted in the butt. The improved later version of the .55 caliber Boys Mark I not only had the flat muzzle brake, but also simpler, fixed sights and a Bren gun bipod to simplify its manufacture. The butt plate itself was heavily padded with rubber. A front bipod and rear grip were also fitted. Still, recoil was quite significant, causing Australian troops who were issued the Boys to nickname it Charlie the Bastard. The first combat action for the Boys was actually with Finnish forces during the 1939 to 1940 Winter War against the Soviet Red Army. Great Britain sent 200 examples of the Boys to Finland. In the hands of the Finns, the Boys reportedly proved adequately effective against the early Soviet tank designs. Tanks such as the T-26 and BT-5 had thin armour and a distressing tendency to catch fire easily. The Finns were impressed enough with the Boys to later purchase another 200 of the weapons from the Germans, who had captured many of them during the campaign of spring 1941 that ended with the evacuation of Allied troops at Dunkirk. The Germans renamed them Panzerbuchse Boys. Later, the very first German tanks of World War II to be destroyed by British ground forces fell to a Boys. The first 5th Leicesters, who had been sent to aid in the defence of Norway after the German invasion of the neutral country, made a stand at the village of Tretton. Platoon Sergeant Major John Shepherd was commanding a small sub-unit guarding the right flank of a British position when he noticed German tanks approaching on the far side of the Lagan River. Taking up the unit's 55 caliber Boys, which he had never used before, Shepherd assumed a steady, prone position and proceeded to precisely and methodically smack each tank with 3 AP rounds, knocking out 2 of them and making the rest back off out of sight. The success of the Boys, or lack thereof, was also noted during the German invasion of France in May 1940. Despite the fact that the vast majority of the German tanks in use at the time were small, lightly armoured Mark I and Mark II panzers, the former originally intended as nothing more than a training vehicle. The Boys was not a decisive factor in the infantry's defence against armour. Sergeant Edward Doe of the King's Royal Rifle Corps was not impressed by the Boys. The Germans had brought the tanks in, and they were blasting. I actually fired the Boys' anti-tank rifle for the first time in my life. A terrifying weapon. To even fire, you had to hang on to it like grim death, because it would dislocate your shoulder if you didn't. I fired at a tank coming over the bridge that wasn't blown, and I couldn't miss it from about 50 yards away. An officer was right beside me, and I saw this hit the tank, and all it had done was to just about knock the paintwork off. It made a noise like a ping-pong ball. The officer who was beside me said to me, "Leave the blasted thing there, Doe. Get the hell out of it." Sergeant William J. Gilchrist of the Irish Guards had considerably better luck with the Boys. A later report confirmed. France, Belgium, 1940, Boulogne, 23rd May 1940. Sergeant Gilchrist was in personal charge of an anti-tank rifle, which protected the rear of the battalion during its withdrawal into Boulogne on the 23rd of May. For 2 hours, this NCO, with a few men, succeeded in holding their post at a street corner, thus enabling the remainder of the battalion to move on unmolested. Although under extremely heavy machine gun fire, he showed the greatest contempt of danger and continued to keep his anti-tank gun in action. He was instrumental in hitting and setting on fire an enemy tank, thus blocking a street down which the enemy were trying to move. Later in the action, he himself was wounded, but refused to leave his anti-tank rifle until it, and the Bren guns supporting it, became jammed through overfiring. Throughout the whole action, Sergeant Gilchrist showed courage and bravery of a very high order, and set the finest example to the remainder of his platoon. After losing so much war material at Dunkirk, and facing the possibility of a German amphibious invasion, the British were desperate to re-equip their armed forces in the shortest time possible. New and improved weapon designs were neglected for the moment. Industry concentrated on pouring out as many current weapons from existing assembly lines as possible. Thus, obsolete and obsolescent designs, such as the Boys and the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, continued to be produced in great numbers despite their disappointing performance. Approximately 65,000 Boys weapons were manufactured during the war. The Boys was quickly rendered ineffective as an anti-tank weapon by rapid improvements in German tank armour. In North Africa, however, it still proved somewhat effective against lighter vehicles and some Italian tanks, such as the Fiat light tanks and the thin-skinned machine-gun-armed Carro Veloce L 3/35 tankettes. In one single engagement in the desert, the 7th Hussars knocked out 5 of these CV tankettes in rapid order with their Boys anti-tank rifles. In the North African campaigns, the Boys also found use against bunkers, machine gun nests, and even against infantry at long range. In the stony western desert, where the ground was often too hard to yield up good foxholes, infantrymen were forced to make fighting positions of piled stones known as sangers. The impact of the large .55 caliber bullets striking these sangers often produced casualties among enemy infantrymen, from splinters and rock fragments. This trick was used again to engage German paratroopers fighting amid the rubble of Monte Cassino during the Italian campaign. As in Western Europe, the ordinary Commonwealth desert infantryman did not give the Boys rave reviews as an anti-tank weapon, as attested by one Australian account. The Italians counterattacked with 9 tanks and hundreds of infantrymen. Private O.Z. Neal knocked out 3 Italian tanks with his Boys anti-tank rifle, a feat that astounded everyone. The Boys rifle was noted for its uselessness. The British Universal, or Bren gun carrier, was a small, fully tracked, open-topped light-armoured vehicle that was mass-produced during World War II and used by Commonwealth forces on all fronts. A total of some 113,000 of these carriers was manufactured, and they can be likened to an armoured, tracked equivalent of the American Jeep. In addition to the Bren gun, early models were also armed with a Boys ATR, to provide some limited anti-armour defence. In addition to the universal carrier, the Boys anti-tank rifle was also frequently used to supplement the machine gun armament of numerous other light-armoured vehicles. These included the Morris CS-9 light-armoured car, the Morris light reconnaissance car, the Lanchester 4x2 and 6x4 armoured cars, the Humber light reconnaissance car, and the World War I vintage Rolls-Royce armoured cars. As the war progressed, some attempts were made to improve the Boys. The Mark II was a shortened, lightweight version, intended for use with airborne troops, but it was just as ballistically ineffective as its predecessors, and the recoil was even more brutal than the full-size model. A taper, or squeeze, bore barrel was tried to increase muzzle velocity, in the same manner that the Little John adapter tried to extend the useful life of the 2-pounder gun, and experiments were also conducted with the .55 caliber cartridge casing, necked down to fire a .303 bullet at extremely high velocity. However, by that time, the Boys was already being retired. With the advent of improved infantry anti-tank weapons, utilising the very effective high-explosive shape-charge warhead, the Boys quickly disappeared. In English and Commonwealth service, It was replaced by the PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. Essentially a spring-loaded spigot mortar, the PIAT was also rather despised by its users, owing to its nasty spring recoil and short range, but its powerful warhead could penetrate some 4 inches of tank armour. Although the boy's anti-tank rifle rapidly became obsolete during World War II, it served its purpose as a stopgap defence against marauding Axis armour.